It was the night before Thanksgiving. 37 people boarded a routine flight. Only one of them had a plan, and that plan would shock the entire world. The FBI would chase this man for 45 years. They would investigate over 1,000 suspects. They would use cutting-edge technology, NAR evidence, serial number tracking everything they had, and yet nothing. Not a single answer. This is the story of D.B. Cooper, the only man in aviation history to hijack a commercial flight, vanish into thin air, and never be caught. Not then, not now, not ever. And today, after 54 years, yes, 54 years as of this very moment in 2026, this case remains 100% unsolved. Because what you're about to hear is not fiction. Every single detail, the bomb, the money, the parachute, the mysterious tie is real. And the deeper you go into this story, the more you realize just how impossible it all seems. November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving in America. Families across the country were preparing turkey dinners, watching football, getting ready to celebrate. Nobody was thinking about crime. Nobody was expecting the impossible. America in 1971 was a very different place. Airport security was almost non-existent. You didn't need photo ID to buy a plane ticket. You could walk up to a counter, pay cash, give any name you wanted, and board a flight, no questions asked. Metal detectors were barely in use. The idea of body scans, security checkpoints, or bag searches, that was science fiction. In fact, the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, which today is one of the most recognizable agencies in American life, didn't even exist yet. It wouldn't be created for another 30 years, following the September 11 attacks of 2001. That's how different the world was. In 1971, boarding a plane in America was roughly as difficult as boarding a city bus. The Boeing 727 itself was a marvel of that era. A mid-range commercial jet that had been in service since the mid-1960s, the 727 was the workhorse of American domestic aviation. It had a distinctive design feature that no other commercial jetliner shared: a rear air stair, a retractable set of stairs at the back of the plane that could be deployed from inside the aircraft, even during flight. This was a standard safety feature built to allow passengers to board from the tarmac without needing a jet bridge. No one at Boeing imagined it would one day become the escape route of a criminal. This is important because D.B. Cooper knew all of this, and he used it perfectly. In 1971, domestic hijackings were actually more common than you might think. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw a wave of aircraft hijackings, mostly politically motivated, often to Cuba, where hijackers sought asylum. Airlines had loose protocols for dealing with them: comply with demands, keep passengers safe, and let law enforcement handle it on the ground. The industry was not prepared for someone like Cooper, someone who had no political motive, no destination, and no plan to be caught. Now here's a number that should stop you in your tracks. From November 24, 1971 to today, June 2026, exactly 54 years have passed. Think about that. A man pulled off the most audacious hijacking in American history, and in over half a century, not one law enforcement agency on the planet has been able to definitively identify him. 54 years. Let that sit. We've landed on the moon. We've decoded the human genome. We've built artificial intelligence that can write poetry and solve equations. We've mapped the ocean floor. We've sequenced DNA from 50,000-year-old human remains. We have surveillance cameras on nearly every street corner in America. We can track a cell phone to within meters. We can reconstruct a face from a partial skull. And yet we cannot tell you who D.B. Cooper is. How is that possible? That's exactly what we're going to find out. Portland International Airport. November 24th, 1971. Afternoon. It's a grey, rainy day in Oregon, the kind of cold, miserable weather that makes you want to stay home. But one man is moving through that airport with quiet, calculated confidence. He walks up to the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter. He doesn't hesitate. He pays cash exact change for a one-way ticket on Flight 305 to Seattle, Washington, one way. He's not planning to come back the same way he arrived. He gives his name as Dan Cooper. Not D.B. Cooper, that name actually came later, from a reporter's mistake. The name in the system? Dan Cooper. Simple, forgettable, nobody looked twice. Now let's talk about who this man appeared to be, because the FBI's description of him is one of the most fascinating parts of this whole story. He was described as a white male, approximately 6 feet 1 inch tall, 170 to 175 pounds, appearing to be in his mid-40s. He had an olive complexion, not a typical Northern European complexion, some investigators noted. Brown eyes, neatly combed black hair parted on the left. He wore a dark business suit, a plain black clip-on tie with a white shirt, and dark sunglasses. That detail, the sunglasses, is worth pausing on. Why wear sunglasses inside an airport and on a plane? Possibly to obscure his face, possibly to hide the colour or shape of his eyes, possibly just part of the look. But you don't wear sunglasses indoors unless you're either very cool or very deliberate. Cooper was almost certainly the latter. He looked like a businessman, nothing exotic, nothing threatening, just a middle-aged man in a suit, on his way to Seattle for what appeared to be a work trip. He found his seat 18E in the rear of the aircraft, the very last row, and he sat down. He lit a cigarette, and he ordered a bourbon and soda. A bourbon and soda. On the day he was about to commit the most famous hijacking in history. Calm, composed, completely in control. There were 37 passengers on Flight 305 that day, a relatively light load for the short 30-minute hop from Portland to Seattle. The flight crew consisted of Captain William Scott, First Officer William Ratterjack, and Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, seasoned professionals with thousands of combined hours in the air. In the cabin were 3 flight attendants, Alice Hancock, Florence Schaffner, and a 22-year-old newcomer named Tina Mucklow, who had just joined Northwest Orient and was still in the early weeks of her career. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. The 727 took off from Portland at 2:50 in the afternoon. The skies were overcast. Rain hammered the windows. The flight was so short that by the time most passengers had settled in, Seattle would already be on the horizon. It was the most ordinary flight imaginable. And in the very last row of that plane, a man named Dan Cooper reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handwritten note. Florence Schaffner was walking through the cabin when the man in seat 18E handed her a folded piece of paper. She assumed it was his phone number. A passenger hitting on a flight attendant, it happened all the time back then. She slipped it into her pocket without even looking at it. But then the man leaned toward her and said, very quietly, "Very calmly, miss, you'd better look. I have a bomb." Florence went cold. She opened the note. In neat handwritten capital letters it read, "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase, and I want you to sit by M.E." She sat down next to him. He opened his briefcase just enough for her to see inside. What she described seeing was 8 red cylinders, red insulated wires, and what appeared to be a cylindrical battery. It looked exactly like a bomb. Whether it was a real bomb or not has never been confirmed. After Cooper jumped, no explosive device was ever found on the aircraft. Most investigators believe it was likely a convincing prop, something assembled to look the part without being functional. But in that moment, on that plane, Florence Schaffner believed it. And that was all that mattered. He then calmly dictated his demands for her to write down on an envelope $200,000 in negotiable American currency, specifically in $20 bills. 4 parachutes, 2 primary back chutes, 2 reserve chest chutes, and a fuel truck to be waiting on the ground when they landed in Seattle. All of this by 5 o'clock that afternoon. Here's what's remarkable about those demands. Think carefully about what they tell us about this man. First, he asked for $200,000 in $20 bills. Why $20 bills? Not $100 bills, which would have been far lighter and easier to carry. $20 bills. The FBI later calculated that $200,000 in $20 weighs approximately 21 pounds and takes up considerable space. This was either a clever choice, $20 bills are harder to track than large denominations, or it was intentional friction. Some investigators believe he chose $20 precisely because they were common and less memorable in circulation. Others believe he calculated that weight and volume were acceptable trade-offs for the added difficulty of tracking each individual bill. And that $200,000? In today's money, June 2026, that's the equivalent of roughly $1.6 to $1.8 million. A serious sum. Not enough to retire on forever, but enough to disappear. Second, he asked for 4 parachutes. Not 1. Not 2. 4. The FBI initially thought he might be planning to take a hostage and jump with them, which is why they actually complied. They didn't want to give him a defective parachute if a hostage's life was at risk. In reality, he likely asked for 4, so the FBI couldn't be sure which ones to tamper with. If you only have 1 parachute and your captain knows it, they can sabotage it. With 4, they can't risk it. The brilliance of that move is hard to overstate. He used their own caution against them. Third, the fuel truck. He didn't just want money and a way out. He wanted the plane refueled. He had a destination in mind, or at least wanted them to believe he did. Florence took the note to the cockpit. The pilots immediately contacted air traffic control. Seattle authorities were alerted. The FBI was notified in flight, and the decision was made: comply. Give him what he wants. Get the passengers off safely. Do not risk lives for money. As the plane approached Seattle, Captain Scott announced to passengers that there was a minor mechanical issue requiring a brief delay on the ground. Nobody panicked. Nobody knew. The plane touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, known as SeaTac, at around 5:45 in the evening, and everything was waiting for him exactly as he'd demanded. The money, $200,000 in $20 bills, each bill photographed and its serial number recorded by FBI agents before being placed in a canvas knapsack. 4 parachutes, sourced from a local skydiving school. A fuel truck on the tarmac, ready to pump. Cooper got everything, and in exchange, he released all 36 passengers. They walked off that plane not fully knowing how close to danger they had been. To most of them, it had been an inconvenient delay. To the FBI watching from the terminal, it had been one of the tensest hours in recent memory. He kept 4 crew members: Captain Scott, First Officer Ratterjack, Flight Engineer Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow, who had spent the entire ordeal sitting next to him, keeping him calm, talking with him as the plane circled above Seattle. Tina Mucklow would later become one of the most important witnesses in the entire investigation. She spent more time in direct, close proximity to Cooper than anyone else. She said that he was polite, even considerate. He told her not to be afraid. He apologized for the inconvenience. He offered to order food for her. He tipped the airline staff. He was, by all accounts, a gentleman who had just taken a plane hostage and was holding a bag of someone else's money. That contradiction, the courteous hijacker, would become one of the most debated aspects of his psychological profile. Was it an act? A genuine personality trait? A deliberate tactic to keep the crew cooperative? Investigators and profilers have argued about it for decades. The plane took off from Seattle at around 7:40 p.m. with instructions from Cooper fly toward Mexico City, specifically toward Reno, Nevada, where they would stop to refuel. But Cooper had more conditions. He demanded the plane fly at the lowest possible safe speed, no more than 150 knots, at an altitude of no higher than 10,000 feet, with the landing gear down and the wing flaps partially extended. This would make the plane slow and low perfect for a parachute jump. Cooper was clearly knowledgeable about aviation. The way he understood the Boeing 727 systems, its flight characteristics, its rear staircase, it all pointed to someone with serious technical knowledge, either a former military paratrooper, a pilot, an aviation engineer, or someone who had spent months doing meticulous research in advance. You don't know to ask for specific flap settings and airspeed limits unless you understand aircraft. At around 8 p.m., something happened. Tina Mucklow, who had been relaying messages between Cooper and the cockpit, was instructed by Cooper to go join the pilots and stay there. She was the last crew member to see him. She later said that the last thing she saw was Cooper tying the money bag shut using cord cut from one of the unused parachutes and strapping it to his body. He worked methodically, without panic, without hesitation. He had done his calculations. He knew what he was doing, or at least he believed he did. Then the cockpit crew noticed something unusual. The nose of the plane dipped slightly, then corrected, a change in pressure. Captain Scott made note of the position, approximately 25 miles north of Portland, near the Lewis River in southwest Washington state, at around 8:24 p.m. Cooper had lowered the 727's rear air stair, that unique feature of the aircraft that allowed the stairs to be deployed mid-flight, and jumped. At night. In the rain. Over dense Pacific Northwest wilderness. In a business suit and loafers, with $200,000 strapped to his chest, into sub-zero wind chill at 10,000 feet, and was never seen again. Let's think about what that jump actually means physically. At 10,000 feet, air temperature that night was estimated to be well below freezing. Some meteorological reconstructions put wind chill in the range of -5 to -10 degrees Fahrenheit. He was wearing a business suit and dress shoes, no gloves, no helmet, no thermal protection of any kind. He had one, possibly two parachutes from a civilian skydiving school, which may or may not have been appropriate for a jump from a moving aircraft. Experienced military paratroopers, jumping in proper equipment, in daylight, over clear terrain. At designated drop zones they trained for years to do what Cooper attempted to do alone. At night, in a rainstorm, over uncharted forests. Survival experts who have analysed this case have consistently said the odds were not in his favour, and yet no body was ever found. The pilots landed safely in Reno, Nevada. When they opened the rear of the plane, the only things Cooper had left behind were 2 unused parachutes, his clip-on tie neatly placed on the seat, and a few cigarette butts. No Cooper, no money, no trace. The world woke up the next morning, Thanksgiving Day, to one of the most astonishing news stories in American history. A man had hijacked a commercial flight, extorted $200,000 from the airline, and then parachuted out the back into the dark wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. And he had vanished completely. The FBI's response was immediate and massive. They named the investigation NORJAC short for Northwest Hijacking. It would become one of the longest-running, most resource-intensive criminal investigations in FBI history, outlasting careers, outlasting leadership changes, outlasting entire eras of forensic technology. Within 24 hours, agents had combed the entire aircraft. Fingerprints were lifted from every surface Cooper might have touched: the seat armrests, the tray table, the window, the bourbon glass. Within a week, search teams were deployed across southwest Washington, trudging through dense, rain-soaked Pacific Northwest forest in cold November conditions, searching mile after mile for a parachute canopy, a money bag, a footprint, any sign of a man. They found nothing. The terrain they were searching is genuinely brutal. Southwest Washington State in late November is a landscape of dense Douglas fir and hemlock forest, steep river gorges, thick undergrowth, and near constant rain. Visibility through the canopy is limited. The ground is wet and soft. A body or a parachute could lie undiscovered for years in that landscape. Some investigators believe that's exactly what happened. The FBI photographed and recorded every single one of the $10,000 $20 bills before handing them over a painstaking process that gave them a complete list of serial numbers. They believed that if Cooper or anyone using his money ever spent those bills, they'd catch him. Banks and businesses were notified. A partial list was even made available to the public. For years, the FBI received tip after tip. Someone spent a suspicious $20 at a diner in Montana. A man matching Cooper's description was seen at a bar in Nevada. A woman called in claiming her ex-husband had been acting strangely since November 1971 and had once shown her a large amount of cash. Every lead was followed. Almost none led anywhere. By the 5-year mark in 1976, the FBI had considered more than 800 suspects. By the time the investigation was formally deprioritized in 2016, that number had grown to over 1,000. Investigators from multiple field offices had worked the case. Forensic specialists had re-examined the evidence with each new generation of technology. And still nothing definitive. Over the following decades, the case evolved from a straightforward criminal investigation into something rarer, a cultural legend. Deathbed confessions were made, none confirmed as legitimate. People came forward claiming to be Cooper or to know Cooper. Books were written, documentaries produced, an entire community of amateur investigators, researchers, and obsessives formed around NORJAC, some of whom have dedicated decades of their lives to solving it, building databases of suspect information, cross-referencing flight paths, analyzing soil samples. The FBI, to their credit, continued to take tips seriously for decades. But the case was simply too old, too cold, and too mysterious. Every lead seemed to circle back to the same unanswerable question: where did he go? And here's a fact correction from what you may have heard. The destination was not Mexico City, as the final landing Cooper ordered the plane toward Mexico City, but the plan was to stop in Reno for refueling first, and he jumped before reaching Reno. The plane never made it to Mexico City. And the name Cooper? It was actually a mistake by a wire service reporter who confused Dan Cooper with a different suspect named D.B. Cooper, whose name appeared in early police searches. The name stuck. The real man called himself Dan Cooper, and to this day, that name means nothing to investigators. February 10, 1980, 9 years, 2 months, and 17 days after the hijacking, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family outing along the banks of the Columbia River near a place called Tenaba, on the Washington side about 9 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. Brian was smoothing out sand to build a campfire when his hands hit something. He dug it out. 3 bundles of $20 partially decomposed, rubber bands still in place, held together in the same order they had been packaged 9 years earlier. The FBI confirmed it within days. The serial numbers matched. These were $5,800 of D.B. Cooper's ransom money decayed, waterlogged, partially disintegrated, but unmistakably real. It was the first and only physical evidence ever found outside the aircraft, and it raised more questions than it answered. If Cooper had survived the jump and walked away with the money, how did these bills end up buried in a sandbar 9 miles downstream on the Columbia River? The location didn't match where investigators believed he had jumped. The jump site was estimated to be well north of the Columbia River. How did the money? Some theorized the bills had washed down from the jump site over 9 years of Pacific Northwest flooding and erosion, carried by tributaries into the Columbia. Others believed it was evidence that Cooper died in the jump, fell into a river or stream, and the money dispersed downstream over the years as the knapsack decomposed. There's a third theory, one that some investigators find compelling, that the money was deliberately discarded or hidden near the river, and 9 years of weathering and soil shifting eventually exposed it. If Cooper buried most of the cash knowing the serial numbers were recorded, keeping only enough to spend gradually, it would explain why only $5,800 turned up a partial bundle. Not the full amount. To this day, the location of the Tenaba money remains one of the case's greatest mysteries. The other $194,200? Never found. Not a single additional bill across 54 years of tips, searches, and ongoing vigilance from banks and businesses worldwide. Now let's talk about the tie. When FBI agents processed the aircraft after the hijacking, they found one physical item of Cooper's that he had left behind: his clip-on tie. A plain black tie that he had removed at some point during the flight. A cheap $1.49 clip on the kind of tie that tells you this man was not dressing to impress. He was dressing to be invisible. For decades, this tie sat in FBI evidence storage. Then, in the 2000s, forensic technology advanced to the point where investigators believed they could extract meaningful biological material from it. And they did. Partial DNA evidence was reportedly extracted from microscopic particles on the tie, specifically from rare earth elements, titanium particles, and biological material that had been transferred to the fabric from Cooper's skin and clothing during the hours he wore it. This was a massive The titanium particles were particularly intriguing. Titanium was a relatively rare industrial material in 1971, used primarily in aerospace manufacturing and certain chemical industries. If Cooper worked in one of those sectors, it might narrow the search considerably. In theory, a DNA profile could be compared against databases, against suspects, against family members, and potentially identify Cooper once and for all. But here's where the story gets frustrating. The FBI, by their own admission, did not follow up aggressively on the Dina evidence. The tie was collected in 1971, long before Dina forensics existed, meaning it was handled without modern protocols, touched by multiple people over the years, potentially contaminated. The FBI acknowledged they couldn't be certain the Dina on the tie was even Cooper's. Critics, including many of the amateur investigators who have spent years on this case, were furious. They argued that the Dina should have been run against every available database, matched against all viable suspects, and used as the cornerstone of a renewed investigation. The FBI maintained that the contamination issues made it too unreliable as standalone evidence. In 2016, 45 years after the hijacking, the FBI officially closed the active Norjack investigation, stating that resources would be redirected to other priorities. The case remains technically open, but there is no active investigative team working it. Think about that. They had Dina. They had serial numbers on every bill. They had eyewitness descriptions from 2 flight attendants who spent hours in direct contact with the man. They had the precise location where ransom money surfaced. They had a physical evidence trail. And they still couldn't close it. Over the decades, investigators and amateur sleuths have developed several serious suspect theories. Let's walk through the most significant ones. The most famous is Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a man who just 5 months after Cooper's hijacking pulled off an almost identical crime. McCoy hijacked a United Airlines flight in April 1972, demanded $500,000 in ransom and 4 parachutes, and parachuted over Utah. He was caught within days. Largely because he made mistakes Cooper never made. He was careless with the money. He used his real identity in related transactions, and he underestimated how quickly the FBI would close in. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison, escaped, and was killed in a shootout with FBI agents in 1974. The similarities to Cooper were stunning. Both used the rear staircases of 727s. Both demanded parachutes. Both had detailed aviation knowledge. Both had military backgrounds. Some investigators were convinced McCoy was Cooper. The FBI ultimately ruled him out because McCoy was only 27 in 1971, far younger than Cooper's apparent mid-40s, and didn't match the physical descriptions given by the flight attendants, who had spent hours studying. But the McCoy comparison raises a fascinating possibility. Cooper may have inspired copycat crimes. If a 27-year-old Army veteran saw the Cooper hijacking in the news and thought, I could do that better, what does that say about how many people saw Cooper's plan and recognized it as brilliant? Other suspects have included Robert Rackstraw, an Army paratrooper, convicted fraudster, and self-described conman who was suspected by the FBI in the 1970s, ruled out due to aging consistencies, and then re-emerged as a prime suspect for amateur investigators decades later. Rackstraw never definitively denied being Cooper, and he died in 2019 without the mystery being resolved. There was also Duane, whose wife came forward after his death in 1995, claiming he had told her on his deathbed, "I'm Dan Cooper." He had served prison time, had some familiarity with the Pacific Northwest, and matched the physical description in some respects. The FBI investigated and found insufficient evidence to confirm the claim. Dozens more suspects have been put forward over the years. A Canadian named Lynn Doyle Cooper was named by his niece decades after the hijacking. A man called William Gossett reportedly confessed to family members. Each suspect brings new details, new theories, and ultimately the same wall of unanswerable questions. Then there's the broader theory question. What kind of person was Cooper? The evidence points consistently in one direction: trained, disciplined, and methodical. He chose a short domestic flight with minimal passengers. He picked the last row, maximum privacy, maximum visibility of the cabin, closest to the rear of the plane. He wore a clip-on tie easy to remove without fumbling with a knot. He ordered a bourbon and sat calmly. He used precise aviation terminology in his demands. He knew about the 727's rear staircase. He asked for 4 parachutes to prevent sabotage. He specified exact flight parameters. This was not someone improvising. This was someone who had planned for months. Military service, specifically as a paratrooper or in special forces, is the background most consistent with his skill set. The ability to jump from an aircraft at night, in adverse weather, over wilderness terrain, requires specialized training that most civilians simply don't have. The FBI has long maintained that someone with airborne training was the most likely candidate. Some researchers have pointed to the Vietnam era as relevant context. By 1971, hundreds of thousands of American men had returned from Vietnam with combat training, parachute experience, and a complex relationship with authority and institutions. A decorated veteran, trained to operate in difficult terrain, alienated or financially desperate, might look at an airline ticket counter and see an opportunity no ordinary person would recognize. As for whether he survived the jump, the truth is that expert opinion remains genuinely divided. Those who believe he survived point to the absence of a body. The Pacific Northwest is not empty. It has hikers, loggers, hunters, campers, search teams. If a body had landed in the wilderness, someone likely would have found it in 54 years. They also point to the $5,800 at Tanna Bar as potentially consistent with deliberate disposal. A man smart enough to know the serial numbers were recorded might have chosen to bury or discard most of the money. Those who believe he died in the jump point to the brutal physical conditions, the temperature, the speed, the terrain, the lack of proper equipment, and argue that no evidence of survival is also consistent with a body decomposing in dense forest over half a century. They note that the Tanna Bar money showed signs of long water exposure, consistent with the bills floating downstream from a jump site. They note that not a single one of the 10,000 serial-numbered bills has ever surfaced in any financial transaction anywhere in the world. The FBI's own position when they closed the case in 2016 leaned toward the latter. They believed Cooper likely did not survive the jump. But they were careful with their language. They believed. They didn't know. And that word believed is the most honest thing anyone has ever said about this case. What we do know is this. A man named Dan Cooper bought a plane ticket with cash on November 24, 1971. He sat in a window seat in the last row of a Boeing 727 and ordered a bourbon and soda. He handed a flight attendant a note. He showed her what looked like a bomb. He demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. He got them. He sat calmly through hours of circling above Seattle while the FBI scrambled below. He released 36 passengers without incident. He strapped $200,000 to his body, lowered a staircase at the back of a moving aircraft flying at 10,000 feet, and jumped into the dark, rainy sky above the forests of southwest Washington. And he was the tie is still in an evidence bag somewhere in an FBI facility. The Dina sits unmatched in a database. 3 bundles of rotting $20 bills were found by a child on a riverbank. The other $194,200 has never appeared, not in a bank, not in a store, not in an estate, not anywhere. And the identity of the man, the answer to where he went and whether he lived or died, nobody knows. D.B. Cooper remains the only unsolved commercial aircraft hijacking in the entire history of aviation, not just in America, in the world. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. This case has fascinated the world for over 5 decades, and something tells me it will fascinate us for 50 more. If D.B. Cooper survived, he would be somewhere around 95 to 100 years old today if he's still alive at all. If he didn't survive, his bones are somewhere in the forests of Washington state, and no one has ever walked close enough to find them. Either way, he won. If you want to see more deep dives into history's greatest unsolved mysteries, hit subscribe. Drop a comment below. Do you think D.B. Cooper survived? And share this with someone who loves a good mystery. I'll see you in the next one.